Thank you. Thanks very much, Rob, and thank you, Lindsay and Mary and Susan, and I hope I didn't leave anybody out, but the university for inviting me and all of you for being here this morning. I have to say that I just came from speaking to over 1,000 people at the Green Festival and then the Global Summit and so on and so forth, but to me, the most important audiences are you, students, people who are coming into this mess that I've helped create to straighten it all out for my grandson, who's 3 years old. And so I'm counting on you guys to do it. And hopefully we can offer a little bit of inspiration today to help set you on that course. And I also have to say that I'm a little envious of you because I think you're coming into this world at perhaps the most fascinating, exciting, and possibly fun time that human beings have ever experienced on this planet. And that may not ring a bell with you right now, but I think it will, because we are truly in a revolutionary period in history. There's never been any time like this at all. And I think it's one of the things that points this out is that for the very first time in human history, every single human being on this planet, in fact, every single life form on this planet, is being faced by the same crises. Never had this before. San Francisco had earthquakes, Florida had hurricanes, Haiti had hurricanes, and Indonesia had tsunamis and volcanoes, but they didn't really impact each other very much. Today, every single life form on this planet is being faced by global climate change. Whatever you think the causes of that, the glaciers are melting, the oceans are rising. And every single life form on this planet is being faced by the problems of diminishing resources, forests being cut across the planet, resources diminishing at accelerating rates, and things that are essential to life, food and fuel, their scarcity and are increasing at increasing rates. And the prices are increasing at increasing rates. Overpopulation of the human species, extinction of many other species. These are all crises that are impacting all of us. And extreme violence that's due to desperation around the planet. For the first time in human history, we are all facing these crises together. And for the first time in human history, we're all communicating with each other through the cell phones and the internet. My God, you guys know this a lot better than I do. And my 3-year-old grandson, whose name is Grant, I'll talk about him a bit today because he's part of my inspiration, and he's already texting. I can't text, but he can. I guess I can. But you know, it's just amazing to me how we are all communicating. A couple of years ago, I was high up in the Himalayas in Tibet, talking to a tribal, nomadic tribal chieftain up there, about 17,000 feet, standing next to this receding glacier that he's watched recede tremendously for the last 10 years. But we're talking about that, but also he was lamenting the fact that his people would never have telephones because the lines would never get up there. And I would hear the same thing deep in the Amazon. But today, he has a satellite cell phone. I can talk to him this morning when I leave here. We are all talking to each other. And just the other day, I was on a radio phone interview with a small radio station in Phoenix, Arizona. It covers a very small population, actually. But I was getting text questions coming in from Nigeria and Indonesia, from this little radio station that was streaming out of Phoenix, Arizona. And it's just phenomenal. So you are coming into this world at this incredible time when we are so brought together. And I think it's fair to say that, you know, my grandson, Grant, cannot possibly hope to inherit a sustainable, just, and peaceful world unless every child growing up in Botswana and Bolivia and Indonesia and Palestine and Israel has that same expectation. Because we are truly at this point, it's no longer valid to just take care of the United States or California. We have to recognize that you and I are living on a space station. And unlike the space station that was built by our astronauts This one doesn't have any shuttles. You're not going to get off it, regardless of what Avatar may tell you. You're not going to get off it. You've got to take care of it. We've got to take care of it. And we've created a mess. Let's face it. I mean, you know, I could a whole bunch of statistics here. Things like, well, we all know that BP dumped 200 million gallons of oil in the Gulf of, in the Gulf. But how many of you, well, okay, how many of you know that BP dumped 200 million gallons in the Gulf? All right, now how many of you know that Texaco dumped 16 billion gallons of toxic waste in the Ecuadorian Amazon? Well, good, there's a few that do. 16 billion gallons, and most of this country doesn't even know that. And Texaco in the Ecuadorian Amazon did it intentionally. It was not an accident. They did it because they could get away with it. And they're still fighting it in the courts, and today people are dying in Ecuador because of that, and the whole huge area of the Amazon rainforest has been totally destroyed. I've lived in Ecuador. I lived in the rainforest. I was a Peace Corps volunteer there. I've been there and seen this place. And they're fighting it in the courts. A $27 billion lawsuit against Texaco, which is now owned by Chevron, because of the tremendous damage. And they're still fighting it, and as a result of that, people are still dying. And most of us don't know that. How many of us you know that Exxon made $46 billion in profits last year and paid absolutely no U.S. income taxes? Okay, good. And General Electric made $10 billion in profits last year. Not only did not pay any income taxes, got a $1.1 billion rebate. Think about it. So where are we? And I'm going to, you know, this talk is basically, it's leading to a very positive thing because I'm a positive person, and I'm going to talk about what you guys can do to change this. But just to set the stage again a little bit, I think that where we're at in history today is we've marched from a period a few hundred years ago where religious organizations basically ran the geopolitics of the world. And then the next step was governments. And there were governments that were totalitarian, and there were governments that were democratic, republic governments like ours. But the governments basically control things. And in the democracies or the republics, the elected officials wrote the laws. But today we've moved into a new era where the geopolitics is controlled by big corporations. It's no longer controlled by religious organizations or governments. It's the big corporations that are calling the shots. Nobody gets elected to a major position in the United States or any of the other so-called democracies without support of the big multinationals. Nobody. Obama said he was going to, but he didn't. He took tremendous amounts of money from the big corporations, and so he's beholden to them now. I'm not trying to knock Obama. It's just representative of where we are today. Nobody gets elected anywhere in the world today in any major position without multinational corporate support. And the corporations control the mainstream press, either through outright ownership or advertising budgets. In fact, I think it's fair to say that we're at a time in history that's similar to when city-states became nations, except today, the nations are losing their importance. It's the big corporations. We're in a whole new era. And I think it's extremely important for you coming into this situation to fully understand that. This is not a doomsday scenario. This is just reality. We have to understand the reality that we're facing if we're going to impact this world. And I'll give you the good news of that in a few moments. But today, it is these huge corporations. They form partnerships with the Chinese, with the Taiwanese, with the Tibetans. They form partnerships with the Israelis and the Palestinians, with the Argentine people, with the Indian people, with whoever they want. Whoever has resources or markets they covet, they strike the deals, and they end up calling the shots. They are running this system. Have no doubts about it. And really the next question is, so where do we go beyond this? Because we are a constantly evolving species and a constantly evolving economy. And so there's got to be another step. And this is where I take great hope, because I think the next step is us. we the people, bringing the control back to we the people. And when you think about it, corporations are totally dependent on us, on you, to buy their things, goods and services. Unlike empires that are established through military might, this one has been established through selling things. And the marketplace is democratic if we choose to make it that way. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. But before I do, I want to get a little bit lighter and tell you a story about when I was in the Peace Corps. It's back in the late 60s in the Amazon. And the story has some meaning to it. But how many people here have ever seen a shrunken head or a picture of one? Picture of one? Okay, well, the people I was sent to be you've lived with them. People I was sent to be a Peace Corps volunteer with, let me get rid of this, thank you, called the Schwa. I'm from New Hampshire, so I don't pronounce it quite right, but there is an R on the end of that word. In New Hampshire, we don't pronounce the R's if they come on the ends of words, but if you've got an IA at the end of the word, like Laconier, you put an R there. Anyway, so I was in business school. I just graduated from business school, and I went in the Peace Corps, and they sent me to 8 weeks of training camp in Southern California to learn Spanish and about credit and savings co-ops. And then they sent me in to live with the Schwa deep in the Amazon. The Schwa don't speak Spanish. They speak Schwa. So my first assignment out of the U.S. government was pretty baffling. You know, they teach me Spanish and then send me in to live with people who don't speak Spanish. But I very quickly learned that the Schwa had a lot of things to teach me. I also learned that all my vaunted education in business administration had nothing to offer the Schwa because they didn't even have any money. They had no economy. It was all a barter economy. But after I was there for about a month or so, I got extremely sick. I was dying. And I'm going to just carry this around a little bit. Is this okay? So I lost about 35 pounds in a week. I was very, very ill. And there was no way I could get out because to get out I would have to walk for 2 days through the jungle and then take a rickety old bus up over the Andes for another 2 days. And to get to a Peace Corps doctor, there was no way I was going to do that. So I'm kind of resigned to dying out here in the jungle. And then the school teacher, who's the one guy I can communicate with, because the school teacher speaks Spanish. He was Quechua from the Andes. And he maintained that I didn't speak Spanish at all. But he also understood that he could understand me somehow, because I was speaking some strange language that somehow resembled Spanish enough that we could kind of get along. So he comes up to me, and he's leading this decrepit-looking old Schwa man by the hand, and he says, "This guy is the shaman." And I'm like, okay, I'm from New Hampshire. What the hell's a shaman? He says, well, he can heal you. And that got my attention. So this old man steps back and he looks at my feet, he looks at my head, he looks me up and down, and he comes right up close to me, he looks me right in the eyes and he says, "You're dying." And that's good, because the Schwa believe in reincarnation. And he figured my life was about as bad as it was going to get. Time to move on. And so I started crying at that point, I think. So he says, "Oh my God, well, maybe you're not ready to die, in which case I could cure you tonight." I said, "I think I'll take that." So that night he did. He took me on this classic shamanic journey, and I've written a number of books about shamanism. I don't think we have any of those here, but they're out there, shape-shifting the world as you dream it. And it was an amazing experience, because that night as I'm on this shamanic journey, what I'm seeing is that my parents, I come from 300 years of Yankee Calvinists in New England. My folks fought in the American Revolution and every war since, and we go back a long time in Vermont and New Hampshire. And what I saw was my parents, you know, we were meat and potatoes people. You didn't eat garlic. You didn't eat any onions. You didn't eat anything that had any character to it at all. Very bland foods, and my mom and dad were extremely hygienic. And now I'm living with the Schwa in the deep Amazon. And the main food of the Schwa is something called chicha, which is, it's made out of manioc roots, and the women chew the manioc root and spit it. and then it ferments overnight, and you drink it the next morning. And it's a beer. It's a kind of a beer. And Susan, you've had enough chicha. It's good stuff, isn't it? It's really good stuff. But, and you don't drink water in the Amazon because the rivers are all polluted by organic matter, and all the indigenous people know that. So they drink a lot of beer because you have to rehydrate a lot. So you drink a lot of chicha. And one of their favorite foods, they have a lot of interesting foods, but one of the favorite ones is you reach inside a decaying log and you pull out a handful of white squirming grubs and you eat them. You know, it's kind of like those little squirmy candies that my grandson loves. What are those called? Those little gummy worms, yeah. And I had to eat these foods and drink this chicha because there weren't any Cliff Bars. That was it. But every time I ate this food or drank this chicha, my mom was hovering over my shoulder saying, "Son, it'll kill you." So it was. Well, that night on this shamanic journey, I saw that something's wrong here because these Shuar folks are about as healthy as anybody I've ever met. According to the World Bank, they're the most impoverished people, one of the most impoverished people in the world because they don't have any money, but they live very good lives in those days especially. They were hunters and gatherers. They had natural food. They had very healthy food. The men were all built like Rambo. And the women were very sexy and fertile and beautiful and wonderful. And people, they're hunters and gatherers, so people often die in accidents, canoe accidents, trees falling on them, gored by a wild boar or something. But if that doesn't happen to you, you're likely to live to be 100. A lot of really old people. So that night on this shamanic journey, I'm saying, it's my mindset that's killing me. It's not the food. It's my mindset. And that, I think, is what's going on today for us, too. We have a mindset. And we have developed, with this mindset, a failed system. I'm an economist. My official title when I was in Economic Hitman was chief economist at one of the nation's major consulting firms. And as an economist or any human being, I'd have to say that there's no question but what we've created a totally failed system. So when you've got 4% of the world's population living in the United States, consuming more than 25% of the world's resources, while roughly half the world is starving or on the verge of starvation, that is a failed system. It's not a model. We can't pass this on to India or Africa or Latin America. You'd need another 5 or 6 planets just like ours without people to make that happen. We failed, and we failed badly. And so we must turn this thing around. And the failure, I think, has come out of a mindset. So I want to talk just for a few minutes. How much time do I have, incidentally? 11:30. To 11:30. Okay, but some of you are going to have to leave at 10:30. It's only 9:30 now. I'm good with a clock. I can handle a clock. So as an introduction to that, I just want to talk a little bit about what I did as an economic hitman, in case some of you haven't read the book. I think it's fair to say that we economic hitmen have created the world's first truly global empire. And it's the first empire that's been created primarily without the military, through economics, through economic hitmen. Every other empire was created by sending primarily young men off to conquer other lands. But this one has been done a different way by economic hitmen. And there's many different ways that we work. But I think the most common one, perhaps you could say the generic one, which I used a lot, was that we will identify a country with resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. But the money never actually goes to the country, never even enters the country. Instead, it goes to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in that country. Things like power plants, industrial parks, highways, ports, that benefit a few wealthy families in that country, but not the majority of the people who are too poor to buy electricity, don't have cars to drive on the highways, don't use the ports, can't get jobs in industrial parks because they don't hire many people. And yet they are left holding a huge debt, the country, the people. And it's a debt they can't possibly repay. And in trying to repay it, paying some of the interest, they have to divert money from education, healthcare, and other social services constantly. So they have to forego a lot, make huge sacrifices, and in the end, they never can repay anyway. So at some point, we go back in and we say, hey, listen, since you can't pay your debts, give us a pound of flesh, sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies, or allow us to build a military base on your soil, or vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote. And in that way, we've really created this empire. And in the few cases where we fail, I talk in my books about how I fail with Jaime Roldos, the democratically elected president of Ecuador, and Omar Torrijos of Panama. I couldn't bring these men around. I couldn't corrupt them. I couldn't get them to accept these lousy deals for their country and put their countries in debt. They had integrity. And in those cases, the jackals go in. And these are people that either overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. They work out of the CIA for the most part, but usually are not CIA employees. They're private contractors. And both Jaime Roldos of Ecuador and Omar Torrijos of Panama were assassinated because I didn't bring them around. We just tried to do a similar thing in Ecuador with Rafael Correa, a personal friend, president of Ecuador. We just tried to overthrow him in a coup because he's refusing to pay debts and many other reasons I can talk about later. He survived the coup last month. Last year, we did have a successful CIA coup against President Zelaya of Honduras because he stood up to Dole, Chiquita, Cargill, Kraft, Russell's Athletic, and Nike. So this is the way the system is working. And in the few cases where the economic hitmen and the jackals both fail, like with Saddam Hussein, then we send the military in. The military goes in as a means of last resort. But in every one of these cases, these people are essentially working for our corporations because this is a corporate-driven system. Whatever you may think, it's a corporate, whatever we've been told by our government, it's very much oriented toward the corporations. And we can talk more about that a little bit later. But so this is the way that this world that we've created has come about. And so today, for the first time in human history, we have a global empire. And it's a secret empire for the most part, because most of us don't realize this has been going on. And when the Romans or the Greeks or the Spaniards or the Portuguese or the French or other people, the British built their empires, everybody knew they were doing it. And usually people were very proud, spreading civilization. There was some glorious reason, spreading civilization or spreading Catholicism or something. But always it's been about stealing resources. And yet in those days, on those other empires, people took great pride in the fact that they were sending their young men off to spread civilization or whatever. Today we've done this very secretly, and I think we have to, and you students of international studies and law and sociology and politics and whatever else you're studying, need to really come to grips with this, because it's very important for us to understand that a democracy is built on the premise that you have an informed electorate. And if the electorate doesn't know this most basic part of our foreign policy, we're not informed. And if we're not informed, we really can't vote democratically. It's why I write the books. It's why I'm standing here today. I'm a very, very loyal American. I believe, I'm a very, very conservative American. I believe in the original principles, government of, for, and by the people. And I'm a conservative because I believe in true conservation of the environment. That's what a conservative believes in. And I believe in the great founding principles of this country. And they've been usurped. We've been taken over by a bunch of robber barons. Jack Welch of General Electric, I'll call them by name. I meet with them and call them by name on stage. Phil Knight of Nike, there's a bunch of them. They've usurped the democratic process in this country. In fact, I would go so far as to say, I don't think there's a major institution in this country today that's supporting democracy. I don't think our healthcare system is supporting it. I don't think our banking system or our financial system is supporting it. For the most part, our educational system isn't supporting it. Our businesses aren't supporting it, and our government's not supporting it. you know, even if a president were to get elected in this country without taking any money from the corporations, he'd still be surrounded, probably couldn't get elected that way, but let's say Dennis Kucinich does get elected president and he doesn't accept any money from the corporations, he's going to be sitting there all alone, surrounded by congressmen and women who are beholden to the big corporations, surrounded by 35,000 lobbyists in Washington, D.C. today. 35,000 lobbyists in Washington, D.C. alone who work for the big corporations. So here we are. We've created this empire. And I think you have to ask yourself, if we have a secret empire out there, who's the emperor? Well, an emperor is not elected, doesn't serve a limited term, and reports to no one. It's pretty obvious our presidents don't satisfy that definition. But we have a group of people who run our biggest corporations. I call them the corporatocracy, who do. And I want to be very clear on this. This is not a conspiracy theory. I don't believe in a conspiracy here. These people don't even know each other, most of them. They've never met. They don't have to get together to conspire to do anything illegal. But they're driven by one set of goals, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But these are the people that are truly calling the shots, the heads of the big corporations. They're not elected. They don't serve limited terms. They report to no one. They like to say they report to their boards of directors, but they all serve on each other's boards and they just rubber stamp each other. They are calling the shots. So we're at this situation where we've got these mostly men, a few women, who run our politics, control our press, really call the shots up there. And they are all driven by three goals, really. And these three goals were, I think, perhaps best defined by Milton Friedman of the Chicago School of Economics. When I went to business school in the 60s, we were all Keynesians, John Maynard Keynes. Nixon one time said, we're all Keynesians, and he was. But this all changed. In the 70s, I, as an economic hitman, and others began to adopt the principles of Milton Friedman. And then in 1980, Ronald Reagan totally embraced them. Margaret Thatcher did. Odson of Iceland, many other world leaders embraced these ideas. And every president of the United States has since, Democrat and Republican alike. And the three driving principles here are, yeah, get your pens out, write notes on this. It's all in Hoodwink. Buy the book. And incidentally, I'm not selling the book. The university or some bookstore is. I don't get anything off this, but I do like to sign them and have you read them. So the first principle is that the sole responsibility of business is to maximize profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. Now, I was not raised with that when I went to business school. I was told that a good CEO has a fiduciary responsibility, has a responsibility to his employees and his or her suppliers, customers, and the communities where the business is located. Has a huge responsibility to be a good citizen of the communities. But that all changed when we moved from Keynesian economics to Friedmanian economics. Friedmanian economics, something to moan, because this driving principle was none of that's important. The only thing that's important is to maximize profits, regardless of everything else. To hell with the employees, to hell with the suppliers, to hell with the community. Just maximize profits and everything else will take care of itself. We've seen that doesn't work. Second principle, businesses shouldn't be regulated. Minimize regulations because regulations get in the way of making profits. And everybody knows that CEOs have tremendous integrity, would never rip off anybody, right? Yeah, look at Enron. Look at what's gone on with Wall Street. Rip off, rip off, rip off. And the third, so that premise doesn't work too well either, but that's part of it. No regulations or minimize regulations. And the third principle is that everything should be done by business. Privatize everything. Privatize the schools, the jails, the military. We're privatizing the military. We've got more private contractors in Afghanistan today than we have loyal American soldiers. And these private contractors are not necessarily loyal to anybody except the dollar. So these three principles, maximize profits, no regulations, and privatize everything, have contributed to this failed system that we have today. It's a very, very greedy approach. Capitalism is about 400 years old, give or take a few hundred years, and it's been through many iterations. It's a chameleon, it's adapted. This iteration, I think, is perhaps one of the ugliest we've ever experienced. I call it predatory capitalism. This is not a condemnation of capitalism. I'm a capitalist, but I don't like this form of capitalism because it's not working. And it's very unjust, it's very unsustainable, and we need to get rid of it. So if we go back to that mindset idea, you know, what made me sick in the Amazon was a mindset. And what we've got today is these people who are running everything, what I call the corporatocracy, not a conspiracy, but they've all bought into these three principles. So whenever anybody challenges any one of these three principles or tries to write laws that challenge it in any country, these guys all mass together, not in a conspiracy way, but they just all fight it because they all want to buy into those three principles. And so to me, what the hope here is, what you young folks bring to this, as you move up, you're going to be running these organizations, and you're writing about them, or painting about them, or dancing about them. I don't know what your passions are, where you're going to take your passions, but you're going to be in charge of the system. And what I would suggest is that there's a fairly simple solution here, in principle. And that is simply to change the mindset. So if we go from this one idea that the only responsibility of business is to maximize profits regardless of social and environmental costs, and we say no. The responsibility of business is to make a decent rate of return, profits, for your investors, but only within the context of creating a sustainable, just, and peaceful world for every child on the planet. And I have to recognize that when I hold my 3-year-old grandson, or we walk through the forest together, and he's into hugging trees. He's really into, I live up in the state, I live just north of here in Washington. And we spend a lot of time in the woods, and I have to recognize that, you know, the only way he's going to get a sustainable, just, and peaceful world is if every child on this planet gets it. That's the fact of life today, the small space station we're living on. And so if we set that guideline that businesses make profit, but only while being socially and environmentally responsible, and to recognize that we do need regulations to back that up. We know that when I went to business school, I was told there will never be another depression like the 30s, or like the one we're going through right now, because we put laws and regulations in place that would prohibit that from happening again, and it was true. But then we erased those laws. You know, everybody knows about Glass-Steagall, but there's a lot of others. I think we need to reintroduce some of those, we know that, but I think we also need to come up with a new standard that enforces this idea that businesses must serve us. They must be environmentally and socially responsible. We must enforce that. So this should be the new playing field out there. And there's a wonderful precedent here in the United States. The first 100 years that this country was a nation, no corporation could get a charter unless it proved it was going to serve the public interest. And charters lasted on average for 10 years. There were exceptions. If you had to build a highway and a bridge that was going to take 20 years, that was an exception. But in general, charters lasted 10 years, and then the corporation had to go back and prove that it had served the public interest and would continue to do so. That was all negated in the late 1800s when the Supreme Court decided that corporations had the rights but not the responsibilities of individuals. I think we need to reestablish some sort of a standard like that that says the business of corporations is, okay, make profits, but the business of corporations is to serve us, the people, not a bunch of CEOs that are making outrageous salaries and stockholders that are willing to rip off the planet in order to do that. So it's a fairly easy approach here, and as you move into this world of taking control, keep being driven by this concept that we can do this, that we can create a playing field that will create a just in a sustainable and a peaceful world. And we must do that. How many of you either already have children or think you might want to have children one day? That's a pretty good number. So you probably would like those children to grow up in a decent world. So we've got to make that happen. We've really got to push for that. And I'm very, very struck by how what we really need to do here, what you need to do, it's all falling on your shoulders. It's really nice to be an old fart standing up here saying, you know, I screwed everything up and now you fix it. But I'm committed to working with you as long as I stay on this planet in a human form. So I'm with you. But then it goes into your hands to take care of my grandson. I think the other thing that we really need to look at is how do we create a new economy? How do we really create a new economy? So our economy here in the United States today, as we all know, is very, very strongly driven by the military. 60% of our discretionary budget goes directly toward military operations. Another 20% is spin-offs to that, the banking industry that revolves around it, the food services industry, the healthcare services industry. And we're seeing that that's not really working. It's always interesting to me how both parties talk about reducing government spending, but nobody talks about reducing military spending, which is the biggest part of the budget by a long shot. And we're seeing that, you know, I mean, it's not exactly being very effective. We haven't really made Iraq a better place. I don't think we're making Afghanistan a better place. Pakistan is suffering terribly from our interventions over the years. So how do we move out of that mentality? And another huge part of our budget, beyond that, goes to creating paper, you know, all these financial things that none of us really understands. I don't even remember the names for them. I am an economist by training. And then another percentage goes to creating trinkets, crap that we don't really need. Meanwhile, half the world starves. Go figure. What kind of a world is this? And I was just recently in Nicaragua with a group of philanthropic investors, people who'd made a lot of money primarily in dot-coms, et cetera, in this country, wanted to help campesino farmers develop organic farming. One of these guys was one of the presidents of Whole Foods. Whole Foods was committed to buying organic foods from Central America. But as we traveled around Nicaragua and talked to campesinos, we discovered that a great deal of the land there has been totally destroyed by Dole and Chiquita and Kraft and Cargill, the big agricultural businesses who've made it impossible to farm it organically. We also looked at the water. Nicaragua's endowed with wonderful water resources, 2 huge lakes you can't see across, terribly polluted by industry, primarily industries that serve us. And I was struck at that point by, wouldn't it be amazing if you and I insisted that some percentage, I don't know, we can start anywhere we want, but some percentage of that military budget would go to pay the same companies, Raytheon, General Dynamics, General Motors, General Electric. There's a trend here. Why are they all generals? Sergeant Electric, Lieutenant Motors. Pay these same companies to, instead of making missiles and body armor and tanks and so on and so forth, to create technologies that will clean up the polluted lands of Nicaragua and the rest of the world, and the polluted water and the polluted air. We all talk about sustainable energy, and that's important. But what if we took another percentage of the budget and paid Monsanto to, instead of coming up with GMOs that we all hate, to create ways for the starving people of Africa to grow food more efficiently, store it, transport it, feed themselves? And what if we took another percentage of the budget to create ways that we can all really communicate better in a loving way and can interrelate with each other and can start to really solve the problems that come from misunderstandings between Christians and Muslims and Jews and so on and so forth? I mean, I think there's a whole economy out there that's waiting to happen. And we don't have to wipe out the big corporations that are currently doing things we don't like. Let's just redirect their energies. And also, let's take a large percentage of these budgets and pay you to be entrepreneurs, to come up with your own businesses, and to support local businesses. I'm all for the whole local business scene. But it has to be, the local businesses aren't any better than the multinationals unless they buy into this new idea of creating profits, but only within a sustainable, just, and peaceful context. So I think there's a huge, huge opportunity here for us to move to a new level of consciousness, into a new form of economics that truly helps us understand that we've got to move out of this predatory system into a system that creates something that will make this world a good world for my grandson and yours and every other kid on this planet. And we can do that. It's very much within our means to do it. But we must put our hearts and our souls to it. And again, you know, really all it takes is that mindset change. Profits, but only while being socially and environmentally responsible. And this goes back partly to the marketplace being democratic. Every time you buy something or choose not to, you're casting a vote. And I personally think, after this last election, I'm coming more and more to really believe that the vote I cast every time I buy something or don't is perhaps more important than the one I cast in the polls. I hate to say that. The elections are important too. There's no question, government's important. But what we have to understand is that our elected officials are not going to move against the corporations until we convince the corporations that it's to their best interest. And a little story along with that is that, as an example, a few years ago, Florida Power and Light, one of the nation's largest utility companies, was pressured by the Public Service Commission of Florida to build a coal plant. They wanted FP&L to diversify out of gas and oil and nuclear into coal. And the head of the environmental department of FP&L said, "I will not permit a coal plant in the state." This is a woman. She happens to be my wife, Winifred. And she said, "I will not permit that plant. You can fire me. You're going to get my people to permit it. I don't have any control of that. I won't permit a coal plant in Florida." And to make a long story short, the people of Florida said the same thing. Every place FP&L went to get that plant permitted, every community turned it down. So FP&L never built the coal plant. And in the process, FP&L came to the conclusion that they ought to start developing wind and solar. Today, they're the largest developer of wind and solar in the United States, one of the largest in the world. My wife, who was almost fired for her position, is now one of the most valuable employees because she's the only one who has credibility anymore with the environmental agencies, the EPA and the Sierra Club and all the other ones out there. But perhaps even, so the people of Florida did this. It was we, the people, that made this happen by refusing that coal plant. Florida's a pretty conservative state politically, but they took, every community after community took this very strong stance. And I think it's so significant that until this happened, FP&L sent their CEO once a month to Washington. They spent a lot of money on lobbyists to fight any CO2 tax or anything that controlled carbon dioxide emissions. While they wanted to build the coal plant, they constantly fought. They joined all the coalitions. They joined Georgia Power and the other big coal companies and fought all the laws that would restrict carbon dioxide emissions. Today, their CEO goes to Washington twice a month or so. They're spending a lot of money to try to get taxes on CO2 emissions because now they don't want Georgia Power to steal any more of their customers because they're producing cheap electricity while causing terrible pollution. And FP&L is saying, let's level the playing field. And I think that's so significant that when we, the people, you, speak out, and you do it through a corporation, and this is why I think corporations are so important, because these guys controlled a lot of lobbyists, a lot of money, and they've swung all of that around. So now they're supporting these new policies. We need to do that a lot more. So it comes back to what can we do? What can you do? And I think it's, you know, I guess what I would like to say to you people coming up now, entering into this amazing time in human history. And it is an amazing time. It's a time that's been prophesized by every indigenous culture that I know, and I've worked with indigenous cultures. After I stopped working with the Shuar, incidentally, after that shaman healed me, a few days later, he came up to me and he said, he looks me up and he looks into my eyes and says, "I cured you." And I said, "Yeah," and he said, "You owe me." And I'm like, well, okay, so you guys don't have money, so $5 will probably take care of it all. And he said, "You be my apprentice." So here I am, I don't even know what a shaman is, and I become a shaman's apprentice back in, this is 1968. And I've been studying shamanism and writing about it all over the world since then. That got me started on another course, which is sort of went parallel to being an economic hitman. It's a strange interweaving there that I can talk about more during questions and answers if you want me to. But, so I've spent a lot of time in many indigenous cultures. I take groups down to the Mayans to study 2012. Every December, we're leaving in 2 weeks. I've got a group of people going down there. I think you guys should all take a break from your classes and come join us in Guatemala. Do great fire ceremonies in Tikal and sacred sites. But every one of these cultures, we all probably know of the prophecy of 2012, which actually is a very positive prophecy. It says that we are going to change the world, and if we don't, there may be doomsday, but it's not at all the way Hollywood paints it. It's the Mayans are saying we're coming to the end of an old period, a brutal period, and we have the opportunity to enter a much more compassionate time where we'll all work together on the planet. And every indigenous culture I know has a prophecy that tells us that we're at this phenomenal time in human history. How many of you know the Pachamama Alliance? Anybody here? Yeah, okay, so great. Yeah, so they're in San Francisco. If you don't know it, look it up, pachamama.org. And we have this great program called the Awakening the Dreamer Symposium, and we're starting a whole new set of them that for college organizations, and we'd love to bring one here to this campus. Maybe we can make that happen. So anyway, go to pachamama.org, Awakening the Dreamer. So here we are at a time that every indigenous culture has said, this is a time for the potential for tremendous transformation. But we must act. We must do something. A few years ago, I was in Leh, Ladakh, which is called Little Tibet. It's an Indian protectorate up in the Himalayas. And the Dalai Lama was up there at the same time, and through a strange series of circumstances, I ended up sitting next to the Dalai Lama in the airplane flying from Leh, Ladakh to Jammu. It happened because I was with a group of people I was leading, and we were in the airport ready to fly out, and the Dalai Lama and his entourage come in. They're going to be on the same flight, and he's carrying my book, Shape-Shifting. Wow. So one of our people went up to him and said, "Did you know the author of that book is on the flight with you?" And the Dalai Lama said, "Well, invite him up to sit with me." So, so I ended up sitting with him, and as a result of that, he invited the 30 people that I was leading on this trip to spend the afternoon at his house with him in Dharamsala a few days later, and we did. And, and he just opened it up to any questions we had. There were some really interesting questions. I get into more of those later, but the one that I want to mention is that one of the people said, you know, there's this guy, a writer in the United States, who's calling on everybody around the world to take 5 minutes off at noon on such and such a day to pray for peace. What do you think of that, Your Holiness? And the Dalai Lama says, well, you know, praying for peace is a good thing. Meditating for peace is a good thing, with one exception. If you pray for peace, and you walk out and you say, I've done my job, that's all I need to do, that's bad. You've got to pray for peace, meditate on peace, and take action. You must take action. And here's probably the most preeminent spiritual leader in the world today. The Pope seems to have taken a bit of a tumble, but the Dalai Lama is on the rise. Great spiritual leader, but he's not telling us to pray, just meditate. He's saying do that, but you also have to take action. And the shamans always tell us that shape-shifting happens, that's the title of one of my other books, because we have a dream, we have an intent, we have a purpose, and we give it energy, and that means taking action. So you have to have both, the prayer, the dream, the meditation, and you have to take the action. So I'm going to wind this up and open it to questions and answers pretty soon. I think, well, we've still got a lot of time, don't we? But we can go into a lot more things then. During the questions and answers, we can get into, I can find out what you're really interested in, because I could talk here for, sometimes I do, for days on end. But I think I'd just like to look at what are some of the other things that we can all do, and you can do. One of the most important to me is, who do we have as our icons? Who do we set up as the people that we want to emulate, or we want our children to emulate? And I have to say that I'm shocked as I walk through airports, which I do a lot, and I look at the magazine covers. And I see people on there that I don't want my grandson to behave like them. You know, whether it's all about, you know, the multiple affairs that they're having in Hollywood these days, which they've always had, who cares, you know? Or whether it's about some corporate guy who's made more money than anybody else, who cares, you know? I mean, that's not what I want my grandson to look up to. Or some sports guy who makes more money than anybody else. Speaking of such, I've always been struck by Tiger Woods. This is an interesting case, I think, that we came down really hard on Tiger Woods because he had a sexual addiction. I don't think his sexual addiction is going to impact my grandson's life. But the fact that Tiger Woods accepted millions and millions of dollars that were made on the backs of slaves in sweatshops in Indonesia, that's going to impact my grandson. That impacts all of us. And I often think, why did we come down so hard on Tiger Woods for a sexual addiction when we never even mentioned the fact that here's an African American who's making fortunes off slaves in sweatshops in Indonesia and around the world? Think about that. What if Tiger Woods had gone to Reebok and said, hey, you know, instead of $40 million a year from Nike or whatever he was making, I'm willing to accept $10 million a year. I think I can live on $10 million a year. I think I can buy a few golf balls for $10 million a year. So you just pay me $10 million instead of 40, and cut all your executives' pay by 20% or whatever, and have all that money go to the people in the sweatshops in Indonesia. We're not opposed to people working in factories in Indonesia, but they need to get a living wage and have reasonable working conditions and get pensions, retirement pensions, and health care. You give them that, Reebok, and I'll go out on the road and advertise for Reebok. I think if Tiger Woods had done that, it might have changed the world, at least the retailing business of the world. It would have changed Nike, it would have changed Reebok, it would have opened the doors to all of us. But we don't criticize him for the fact he didn't do that. We criticize him for the fact that he had romances. Just switching sides here. So who do we set up as our icons? The other day I was, you know, looking at a magazine rack in an airport, and there's this guy with the funny hairdo from New York, the guy who's made his fame firing people, Donald Trump, you know, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired. Now, why is this guy so famous? Do I want my grandson to grow up thinking that's the way to behave? You're fired, you're fired. And Jack Welch. I lecture at a lot of MBA programs, and Jack Welch is kind of held up there as this icon, this example. But Jack Welch made his fame by fighting the state of New York that was trying to get GE to clean up the Hudson River. The Hudson River was terribly polluted, carcinogens that were killing, more than anybody else, they were killing GE employees who lived along the Hudson. And Jack Welch, as a vice president, fought the state of New York tooth and nail and won, and was promoted to be GE's youngest president. And as soon as he got in that job, or very soon thereafter, he laid off a quarter of his employees and gave himself a huge raise and big bonuses. And he said, I'm making this company lean and mean. He made it very mean. And then he proceeded to turn GE from a major manufacturing company into basically a financial services company, and sent all those jobs overseas. I don't think this guy's a hero. I think he's a robber baron. And I think we need to look at these things. I don't think Phil Knight's a hero. You know, Nike has sweatshops, vicious sweatshops still. And I think we really need to look at who are the people that we want to emulate. And there's plenty of them out there. People that founded organizations like Rainforest Action Network, Pachamama Alliance, you know, tremendous numbers. Mohammed Yunus of the Grameen Bank, and there's so many of them out there. So I think one of the things that is imperative and important for you to think about is, who do you want to shine a light on in your lives? Who are your heroes? And how do you get those heroes to get more recognition? How do we bring these things out into the forefront? How do we make that part of our culture? Because after all, the people that we worship, the people that we hold a light on, become us and our children. That's who they want to emulate. So consumer response, in the book Hoodwink, I talk about 5 different areas that we all can participate in to turn this thing around, and I've touched on a couple of them. Consumer responsibility, how you shop. If every one of, well, here we are, is this a Nike school? No? Good. Okay, not, well, University of Wisconsin was. And I spent a while going around to various campuses at the University of Wisconsin saying, hey, you know, you guys, if you just send emails to Nike and tell them you're not buying from them anymore, and send emails to your university and say, we don't want you to buy Nike anymore until they turn around. I want nothing more than to wear the Nike swoosh as a representative of a socially responsible and environmentally responsible company. But they can't do that right now. So if we all send emails saying to Nike, we want to wear the Nike swoosh, but we want you to do a better job. And the University of Wisconsin just a few months ago got rid of their contracts with Nike, totally. I take full credit for that. Those are the way things work. We have tremendous influence over corporations. When I was going to college, we boycotted the corporations that supported apartheid in South Africa and got rid of apartheid. When I went to college in Boston, business school, walked beside the Charles River, you couldn't do that. You couldn't walk next to it. It stank so badly. It was so polluted. And rivers in Ohio were on fire with pollution. We ended that. We got the corporations to clean them up despite Jack Welch. And we got corporations to get rid of aerosol cans that were destroying the ozone layer. We got them to open their doors wider to women and to minorities. Recently, we've got rid of trans fats in food and antibiotics in chickens because we, the people, speak out. It doesn't take a lot of us. We have a tremendous power. You have tremendous power. Now we need to ratchet this up a notch. And we need to say all those things are important, but what's really important is you only buy from a corporation that's committed to creating a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. This is the new goal, and we let them know, and we constantly send them email. This email thing is so powerful. And we sign the petitions. You can go to dreamchange.org, another nonprofit I created, and there's a link there to this site that's filled with petitions that you can sign a petition, whatever your passion is. Don't sign all the petitions. Sign the ones that you really believe in. They're there. It's easy to do that. There's tremendous, tremendous power in that. We have incredible power over these corporations, and to change this through the way we shop, through the communications that we send, through encouraging a whole new economy, as I talked about before, that focuses on sustainable energy, that focuses on producing food for starving people around the world, and that focuses on cleaning up our terribly polluted planet. There's tremendous room for growth. If anybody tells you we don't want any more growth, just go and hang out for a little bit in the Congo or Nigeria or Bolivia and look at the starving people. We need growth, but we need it in certain directions that are going to get rid of poverty. Poverty is the other driving force behind corporations. This business of maximizing profits and keeping a lot of people poor, because feudal lords, which our corporate executives are, the equivalent, feudal lords have always recognized that you need a slave base. You need all those people outside the castle walls that are totally under your control. And if we can get rid of poverty, we must embrace poverty. We must get rid of poverty in your lifetime. We must end poverty. So there's so many things that we can do along these regards. Create a new economy, consumer responsibility, who are the icons that we follow. And I think one of the most important ones is to embrace what I would like to, just for lack of a better term, called the deep feminine. I think it's terribly important that you women come into your own as women, and not as a lot of the women executives who basically are men in women's clothing, I think, but to really embrace the nurturing receptivity that goes along with the deep feminine. The Shwa, the Achwa in the Amazon tell us that men and women are equal, but they have very different roles. Men cut trees, they kill animals for protein, they kill other men in warfare, and they're sort of, they do the destructive things. Women take care of the children and the plants, and they have another very, very important job, and that is that women must tell men to stop. Don't cut any more trees, the clearing is big enough, we've got a big enough house. Don't kill any more birds, we've had enough protein this week. Don't kill any more men, we don't need any more war. And the women take this very active role in telling the men to stop, because it's recognized that men will just keep on cutting trees and killing birds because that's the nature of men. And the Chua people come here, and in fact we've got some coming in for the Pachamama Alliance luncheon November 17th here in San Francisco, and you're all invited. Go online to pachamama.org, it's a free luncheon. They'll try to collect contributions from you, but you don't have to give, but you might want to by the end of the lunch. And when they come here, they look around and they say, what's happened to all the women? You know, the men have cut all the trees. They built these huge buildings. They're going to war all the time. Why don't you women stop them? We have the power. You have the power. And, you know, I'm going to bring this to a close pretty soon, but I was struck. What I want to say is that you each have incredible passion and talents. I don't know what your passions and talents are, but I know you have them, each of you. I have a passion for writing and hopefully some talent in it. I don't know what yours are, but I know you have them. Follow them. Follow them. Starting right now. Go to your passion. What's in your heart? What do you most want to do? Because that's what you're going to be most successful at. And use your talents. But let's all use our passions and talents to take us down the road to a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. Growing up as a student of the American Revolution in New Hampshire with these ancestors that went back to there, I was always struck by how fortunate we are that Tom Paine did not try to lead armies. And George Washington did not try to write pamphlets. Paine had a passion and talent for writing pamphlets. Washington had a passion and talent for leading men. Martha Washington had a passion and talent for organizing women to make clothes for the men at the forefront. They each took very different paths. They headed toward the same destination, getting out from under the British yoke, and they got there. We can all take different paths. Sometimes students ask me, so listen, should I go to work for a corporation and try to change it from within, or should I work for a nonprofit and try to change it from without? And I say yes. They both work, depending on you. Where's your passion? Can you go and work for a corporation and really have a passion for changing it from within, or are you going to be seduced, like I was for a number of years? And if that's the case, go to the outside, but follow your passion. It all works. Follow your passion. Where does your passion lie? But let's all head for that same destination of a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. And to recognize the incredible power that you have. Growing up in rural New Hampshire, I had no idea that African Americans in my country had to ride on the back of a bus until Rosa Parks taught me. How many of you here know who Rosa Parks was? Well, who the hell was Rosa Parks? A seamstress, a member of the NAACP. You're Rosa Parks. You can do that. You can walk to the front of a bus. And I had no idea that the DDT my dad and I sprayed on the mosquitoes in the swamp behind our house was killing fish and and birds in addition to mosquitoes until Rachel Carson wrote the book Silent Spring, started a global environmental movement. How many of you know of Rachel Carson? Well, who the hell was Rachel Carson? She's a woman who sat down at a little tiny desk in Pennsylvania one day and started writing a book having no idea that it would ever be published, much less that it would start a global environmental movement. You can do that. That's just, and again, I don't know where your passion are, but there's the equivalent of a Rosa Parks and a Rachel Carson lurking in your heart. Just take it along that route. And how many people here have heard of Jack Woodbury, Richard Davis, or Mrs. Schneer? Oh, we've got a couple. We've been to other lectures, huh? Jack and Richard were my high school English and history teachers. And Mrs. Schneer was my third grade teacher. And I have to say that without them, I wouldn't be standing up here. I would never have written a book. They had a tremendous impact on me. Mrs. Schneer particularly, Mrs. Schneer in third grade, I grew up in this little tiny town in Tilton, New Hampshire. But there was a big reform school in our town. That's where all the baddest of the bad kids in New Hampshire went. And they all had to go to the public school system because that's all there was. And they had to stay until they were 16 years old because that was a state law. So when I'm in third grade, there's this 15-year-old boy in my class with me. Wasn't too sharp, but he was very, very mean. And he didn't like me at all. Can't imagine why. He used to push me around on the playground, and I'd go running back to Mrs. Schneer and crying to Mrs. Schneer to do something about it. Mrs. Schneer didn't know what to do. She could kick him out of school, but she had to let him back in the next week because that was a state law. So finally, at one point, I go running to Mrs. Schneer, and she says to me, "Well, listen, Johnny, you're just going to have to stand up for yourself. You take care of this." And I looked up at her, I'm saying, well, Jesus, but he's big. And she said, well, listen, here's my recommendation. Next time he pushes you, you just haul off and kick him in the shins and run like hell. I don't think she used the H word. But I did. And a funny thing happened. He whimpered. He became my friend. He became my ally, my protector. And it was an amazing lesson. I learned this lesson of taking individual responsibility, A, and B, I learned a lesson of what happens when you stand up to a bully. It was very, very powerful. So our teachers are incredible. How many people here are teachers? Okay, well, listen, those are the professional teachers, but I want to restate that. How many of you are teachers? I want to see every hand. You're all teachers. Come on, everybody, hands. You're all teachers. You're all teachers. Get your hands up there. Every time you speak to someone, you're teaching. You walk out of this room, you're going to be teaching. Every time you buy something, you're teaching somebody something, if you choose to make it that way. We're all incredible teachers. You have the power. You're Mrs. Schneer. You're Jack Woodbury. You're Richard Davis. You're Rosa Parks. You're whoever else I've talked about here. It's amazing. And you think about, we talked about George and Martha Washington earlier. I mean, how many of us really fathom the fact that these guys were traitors? George Washington was an officer in the Virginia militia fighting for the British. He was an officer, essentially, in the British Army. It was Virginia militia, but it was closely tied. And when he went up against his own country, which also happened to be the most impressive, strongest, largest, most powerful military the world had ever seen at that time, when he went up against them, he was creating an act of treason. He was a traitor. He would have been hanged, and so would his wife, if they had lost the American Revolution. How many of us think of that? I mean, this was an amazing act that went on there. And we're at a time now when we're called upon to exercise that same sort of courage, to move out into this world and create that same sort of change. And so I would, once again, really, really encourage you to look to your passions, to look to your talents, and move into this world following your passions, using your talents. But let's all commit to changing the corporations, to bringing them around, and they want to be changed. People in these corporations, for the most part, there's some sociopaths, like I've mentioned, Jack Welch and and Phil Knight and people at Enron, but mostly they're just good people like you and me. And we've sent them a very strong message. We've said, I want cheap t-shirts, and if that means slaves in Indonesia, I'll just look the other way. And I want cheap petroleum in my car. Don't raise the price of fuel, for heaven's sakes. If that means destroying the Amazon rainforest, I'll just look the other way. We need to send a different message. You need to send a different message. We all need to move in this direction. It's an incredibly exciting time. And I'm going to open this to questions and answers now. And I just want to share one quote before I do that. This is a quote that it was written in December 1776. It was a tough time for the United States. George Washington had essentially lost every battle he fought. Our army was not doing well. And Washington was not getting any money. He wasn't getting shoes. He wasn't getting ammunition. He wasn't getting guns for his men. He wasn't getting blankets. They were freezing in Valley Forge. The American people were not supporting him very well. The Continental Congress wasn't supporting him. The country was overrun by Tories and people that even opposed us being in that war. But there was Washington, perhaps the wealthiest man in the colonies, who'd stuck his neck in a noose, and he's hunkered down in Valley Forge, freezing his you-know-what's off. And Tom Paine goes out and visits him and comes back, and Tom Paine writes, and you probably heard some of this, but Tom Paine says, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he who stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." And I think this is so pertinent to our time. And this next sentence that Tom Paine wrote, and I think is marvelous. Tom says, "A generous parent would say, if there must be trouble, let it be in my day, that my child may have peace." If there must be trouble, let it be in my day, that my child may have peace. He goes on to say, "I love the man and woman who can smile in trouble, who can gather strength from distress and grow brave by reflection. By perseverance and fortitude, we have the prospect of a glorious future." By your perseverance and fortitude, you have the prospect of a glorious future. And a couple of hundred years after Tom Paine wrote that, Mohandas Gandhi wrote, "Action expresses priorities." And so I'd like to leave you with this thought before we go into questions and answers, that as you walk out of this room today, right now, and for the rest of the day, and for the rest of your life, think about your priorities. What are your true priorities? I suspect that every one of you has at least a priority that says, I want to live and see the next generations live in a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. But look to your priorities. And remember, Gandhi says, action expresses priorities. What are your priorities? And what actions must you take to express your priorities? And when you look that way, I think what we're going to all come up with here is that 6 decades from now, when my grandson is my age, he's going to look back and say, thank God all those people, all those students and other people got together in the University of San Francisco in November 2010, looked at their priorities, and committed to taking the actions necessary to creating a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. And I really look forward to moving through that with you, and thank you very much.